We are now ready to go into session 3, which is on threat responses with particular focus on organisations. Now, before I introduce that session, I just want to do a couple of quick reminders for people who've maybe joined now for the first time or recently. Just keep your video off and on mute. If you are in a breakout room, then obviously, you unmute yourselves and you switch your videos on, but we'd ask that everybody keeps themselves on mute and video off whilst the speakers are doing their contributions. Also, we do have some therapeutic support available for people should you feel that you need that. And if it's something that you think you particularly need right now and would benefit from, then when it's the breakout session times, just make yourself known to us in the main room and let us know that you would like to access that service. Okay, so session 3 then, on threat responses in organisations, and we're going to begin with a video presentation from Ally Xiang and Ching Li on healthcare systems, cultures of uncare and defensive practices. And this includes some of their thoughts on the use of modern medicine in the context of human separation from nature. And again, our YouTube link to their video is posted in the chat, so you can watch it there if any of you have got problems viewing this video via Zoom. So we'll move to that now. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to our presentation on healthcare systems, cultures of uncare and building sustainability within the NHS. My name's Ali and we also have Ching here. We're members of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Sustainability Scholars. You can find below our Twitter handle as well as further information on the website. We'd like to firstly introduce the sustainability agenda within the NHS. We then go on to discuss the organisational analysis of defences, politics, culture and organisation, teams and trusts, and clinicians and patients, and then provide a reflective piece, hopefully bringing these theories together and conclude and provide possible solutions.
Right, so let's start with what we mean by sustainability within the NHS. So whilst there is growing awareness of the importance of sustainability within the NHS, for many clinicians, understanding what's meant by this is still limited. It tends to be a bit of an aspirational add-on to be tackled after we fix the endless raft of other competing demands. So what do we mean by sustainability? Well, it's more than trying to reach net zero by rationalizing estates. Of course, trying to reach net zero is central within this, but within this, we're also calling for a transformation in our understanding of healthcare so that it's more preventative, empowering and holistic for the health and well-being of patients and staff. For me, if done properly, these latter ideas entail quite a radical transformation. So in order to bring this about, let's first of all think about the barriers and defences that might act as obstacles to this. So we'll think about these from 3 levels using a mix of critical theory and psychoanalysis. Let's start with the politics and culture in healthcare. So from a public health perspective, we've known for decades that health and illness in our population isn't really determined by access to health services, but rather ultimately influenced by socioeconomic circumstances and social inequalities. So in order to really reduce illness in our population, one would have to look at the ways in which our society is structured and its inequalities and the detrimental effect this has on the poor compared to the wealthy. But this quickly becomes a tricky political territory where it's far easier to think about putting in some extra funding to bolster the NHS and crisis services than it is to properly fund social care and education and alleviate poverty. So in parallel to this, I guess clinical treatment's kind of configured in the same way, where a list of risk factors for heart disease and effective drug treatments is given more emphasis than a list of preventative factors. Perhaps this is also in part due to medical research, where there tends to be more funding for curative medical interventions, especially those with a commercial application, rather than those to do with lifestyle and primary prevention. So another strand of how we might think about this is in terms of neoliberalism within the NHS. Now, we could all spend, a day talking about this topic, and I'd really rather not. So I guess I'll just pull out a few threads. So what I mean by neoliberalism is that we are now practicing healthcare in a rather mechanized, top-down and protocol-driven way. We've attempted to make it conform to market forces such as competition, targets, performance management, where health becomes seen as a bit of a commodity for consumer choice. But one problem that arises is that if our targets are not well chosen, they can be quite distorting in themselves. So there are things that are easy to measure, such as waiting times, and things that are harder to measure, such as compassion or quality of care. So one ends up just measuring the easy things. The picture on the right is an example of this problem, where they set a national target for emergency departments where patients should be discharged or admitted to a bed within 4 hours of arrival. And this resulted in many patients being put on trolleys in corridors so as to be counted as being in a bed. This focus on targets, data, and payment by results also adds to the rise of defensive practice. Doctors may order extra tests, not on medical grounds, but to reduce the chance of litigations. Surgeons may avoid performing procedures on higher risk patients. I think all of us clinicians now spend about half of our productive time documenting clinical notes and crisis plans, not really just for the sake of the patient, but in case of what it might look like if things go wrong. And if we zoom the lens right out for a minute, we might also want to think about the discourse of modern medicine in general. So the rise of modern medicine came about primarily at the time of the Industrial Revolution, where we saw a departure from more nature-based ways of living to increased urbanization and work in factories and the diseases that followed. It was a period of rapid growth in scientific technology and understanding, and it gave rise to particle physics, the theory of evolution, germ theory, to name a few. We could look down microscopes and see the invisible, or we could look inside the human body and see how it worked. So whilst this is a great era of medical achievements, it's also brought about an absolute dominance in the scientific discourse within society and how important that is. So the scientific discourse, it inherently focuses on discrete parts and what can be measured and quantified. And perhaps this took us away from an orientation and sensitivity towards relationships and patterns and balance in nature. Within Western culture, we've also had a long and deeply embedded belief that we are at the center of the universe, or at least the world, and we have dominion over nature and all living things. It's hard to say when this came about. Perhaps it's monotheistic religions or Christianity. It's certainly embodied in eras of human thought, such as the Enlightenment. Here's a picture of the Enlightenment garden, which highlights this point. These gardens were symbols of order and control over the natural world. Nature was seen as a force to be tamed and dominated, and the garden is an example of man's triumph over nature. So moving down now from the political and cultural, let's talk about organizations and team dynamics. So here's a quote from the Royal College of Nurses in response to the Mid-Staffs inquiry. The NHS often sets up good people to do bad things. Through constant change, chronic understaffing and unrelenting pressure, staff have kindness and compassion eroded from them. So kind of taking in Sally Weintraub's notion of cultures of uncare, I think that the exposure of these scandals highlights the systemic failures, but also for me, the fundamental difficulties that exist within institutions that are tasked with caring for others. So from Isabel Menzies' work, one can understand hospitals as a receptacle for society's unwanted projections. This includes illness and vulnerability and dependency, where death is sanitized and organized and deposited, and in doing so, frees up society from these intimate and primitive aspects of the human condition. Isabel Menzies coins this concept of a socially structured defense system, which is her description of how defenses against anxiety, guilt, uncertainty are externalized and unconsciously shared among staff members, so that they end up informing the structure and culture and status quo within an organization. This explains why changes to the status quo can appear to be so often irrationally threatening. Tim Dartington argues that it's through this routinization of work practices that we drain the caring relationship of its meaning. He says that clinicians are trained to see people as fragmented and less than whole, a series of tasks and protocols. He argues that instead of structures that focus on inspection and audit and guard against abuse and incompetence, we need to prioritize the conditions for doing good work and offer support and containment for those caring for others. So moving down to the final level to think about staff and patients, we need to think about staff vulnerabilities and the reason why many of us get into healthcare. The psychoanalyst David Bell says we probably mostly enter this field in order to repair our own damaged internal objects. And indeed, there's a bi-directional process here where healthcare staff and patients play prominent roles within each other's fantasy worlds, where they come to represent significant personal relationships. In dealing with these really primitive levels of distress, illness, and vulnerability, the innate need to professionally distance and to defend against these powerful feelings tends to result in denial of one's own vulnerability, which is projected outwards. I think that often within our line of work as doctors, we're trying to bring certainty and control over what is fundamentally uncertain and uncontrollable. And this can engender a desire for omnipotence and a recourse into labels and protocols as defenses against our own uncertainty and guilt.
Thanks, Ching. And now I'd like to give a clinical example of what it's like to be working in a complex, large mental health organization. I think the best way to convey perhaps the nuances and complexities is through a reflective piece I wrote and will be published shortly in the Faculty of Medical Psychotherapy newsletter about my experiences working on an acute female inpatient ward from during the latter part of the COVID pandemic, paying particular focus on psychodynamic and social aspects of the work. I invite you to note your feelings and thoughts whilst I'm reading, and hopefully we can come back to this in the small group discussions. Here I go. Despite having previously worked on the acute female inpatient psychiatric ward when I was a core trainee, I still started the placement with anxiety and fear. The fear was not unfounded as a doctor. I read the incidents that occur: patient assaulting staff, patient assaulting another patient, or patient damaging property. I've been fortunate enough to not have been harmed physically. Maybe I'm particularly vigilant or cautious. The guidance given to always see a patient with a nursing colleague and carry an alarm phone is immensely helpful and reassuring. It's never safe to skip this vital preparation. Induction to the ward helped familiarize a little the setting, the staff, and the patients. The ward surprisingly was a lot smaller than expected, and during my time, there was increasingly a sense of claustrophobia for patients and staff alike. This was made worse by the restrictions imposed on us by the pandemic. Our ward round room was a room for everything: staff safety huddle, handovers, ward round reviews, professional meetings, reflective practice, and informal chit chat and planning in between. It helped build a strong team camaraderie, but I felt we were having to negotiate between ourselves the space physically, showing finite and precarious information technology, hardware, the blurring of boundaries, and also space in my own head. It was frustrating not to have a doctor's office on the ward to base oneself. This reflects the whole ward in a way, staff and patients having to share spaces and time together. Nevertheless, the patients and permanent staff members had their own rooms to retreat to, So it isn't without envy, I think, on both sides. One has the office or desk to call one's own, but the other can leave when the placement is over. I guess it is inevitable that over the time I was there and settling into the job, I became more immune to the unpredictable and fast-paced nature of the ward. Infection control measures became second nature. We became used to only seeing each other through mouth masks and little of each other's whole faces. When our masks were occasionally removed, the common response tended to be that we often were surprised by the other's full face, having probably filled in a different face in our minds. It was additionally very difficult at times to maintain perfect infection control measures when the patients were chaotic and the environment not conducive to maintaining sterility, thus reflecting the messy reality of life. I think it was even harder to practice sustainability under pressures. It felt often like we were constantly getting to know new patients and often felt difficult to know all of them. There usually was not enough time to know each patient in detail. The ward works at a fast pace for the demands of the service, but also seems to work in favor of the patients who do not wish to be there or know themselves, and staff who day in and day out have to be in contact with difficult emotions, behaviors, and histories. Personally, there are frustrations, I think, with the lack of patient continuity when patients are moved around without thinking, and we as a team have to start afresh. It often felt that the ward was powerless to the pressures of bed management and often felt done to, a similar dynamic to how the patients often felt throughout their lives too. Despite this, the staff soldier on and do a good enough job on many occasions. The patients have been interesting and I have learned a lot from them. It's been a privilege to help women, even those who consciously did not want our help, but unconsciously benefited from our care and attention. It felt right to be serving the often perceived less privileged sex, who often had horrendous histories and abuses that inevitably led them to developing mental health problems. One issue that particularly angers me is that the ward does not have a seclusion room. We often have to resort to seclude our patient on other wards. This really tests the nursing staff to de-escalate the situation as much as possible before resorting to seclusion. However, there also seems a message from perhaps the institutional viewpoint and wider society, a sense of misogyny, that again, women patients do not have the same protection and need as the male ones, as evidenced in our own mental health unit, where all the male wards have seclusion rooms, but our one female ward does not. Infrastructure is particularly difficult to change, but the way the unit was initially designed and constructed probably again unconsciously mirrored society's attitudes, the lack of regard to women, and possibly the little importance to environmental factors such as green space that may help with mental health. It also reflects how poorly funded we are in mental health. Overall, it's been immensely interesting precisely because of the challenging nature of the work and environment. I commend each and every staff member in dedicating themselves to working with such difficult patients in crisis, with finite resources and in challenging conditions. The mix of race, particularly, but also gender in the team represents the patient population we serve, and we have a crucial and necessary function within mental health services, a place for patients and family for respite and safety when they are at their worst. We had a weekly reflective practice. It provided a microcosm of the work, for example, staff frustrations, poor attendance, and the lack of continuity. However, it did allow some space and time to get to know some of the team better, to slow down and have the thinking space and hear and work out together the difficulties and feelings arising from the incredibly difficult and demanding work. So I'd like to move on to conclusions and solutions.
Thanks, Ally. So in summary, in a busy, risk and target-orientated organisation, sustainability can end up being a bit of an add-on or at the bottom of the agenda. Existential threats such as the climate and ecological crisis are difficult to grapple with, in part because of the inherent defences and disavowal that already exists within our organisation, forces that tend to promote omnipotence and detachment and defend against vulnerability. In thinking about how to transform healthcare to a more sustainable model, we need to be aware of and account for these political and cultural systems that defend against uncertainty We need to be aware of what gets enacted within services that confront sickness and vulnerability, and how this is defended against through our focus on routines and protocols, our seeing others as fragments and part objects, and projecting our own vulnerability outwards. The emotional labour of caring is significant, and so is the emotional weight of engaging with the climate and ecological crisis. So as well as the structural and ideological shifts that need to occur, there's also a need for us to offer containment and promote staff and team well-being, as it's through this containment that defences can also be lowered and effective change can occur.
So in terms of possible solutions, from the trust level, it's important to get involved with the Sustainability Committee. We've also mentioned at the organisational level to include staff reflective practice, implementing the Royal College of Psychiatrists 10 tips, including medicine optimisation and social prescribing. And there's also quality improvement projects in terms of maintaining sustainability standards across all services. On a personal level, to always work within our limits and to practice good work-life balance.
I think another thing we can learn from, the high profile scandals within the NHS and also from climate activism is that there's also something about the power of the individual voice and of empowerment through collective action. So there've always been whistleblowers and disruptive and critical voices within our system who are more in touch with the vulnerability and the reality, who can help to bring about institutional and political change. So this is a strong argument for a bottom-up approach to change and innovation, and the need for us to empower individual voices. So rather than creating top-down processes of change where people feel that things are done to them rather than done with. So the final part of this talk is about what we do once we put down these defenses. How can we think about connections and engagement? How can we understand connections within our organization, our teams, ourselves and our patients, and how we might bring about a connection to the natural world within this by using an eco-psychology perspective?
So implications for direct clinical work. Probably really already stressed, really getting to know the patient, their background and history, helping them to understand themselves, because I think this is the starting point to self-care and understanding. One cannot care for the planet if one cannot care for oneself. Our college has produced this nature-based history taking in terms of assessing a person's connections to nature, and it will be lovely to be able to return to this in the discussion. So the first part is on histories in terms of early memories, formative experiences and cultural influences. Secondly, on feelings, unpacking the range of feelings about the natural world. On lifestyle, one's pleasures, habits, hobbies, addictions and ideals. And finally, the body as nature, going back to how were you born? What do you know about your early infancy? We'd now like to thank you for your time. Here are our emails, and we welcome any questions and comments you might have. And here are our references.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so that was the presentation by Ally and Ching, and I'm now going to invite Rebecca Nestor to discuss the ideas in Ally and Ching's presentation with them, and also to bring in her own research on trauma and social defences in climate communication organisations.
Thank you, Nadine. And Ching and Ally, it was lovely to watch your video again and to kind of revisit some of those issues that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. The thing that really stayed with me is the way in which the NHS is kind of set up somehow to focus on emergencies and high pressure, and whether that is both a real thing in terms of the experience of working within the NHS and an unconscious defence against the long-term perspective that mitigating climate change needs. And so that might be one reason that we could think about later about what makes it so difficult within the NHS. But we can come back to that, because I think it might be helpful if I offer my thinking first, the research that I've been doing. So I'm interested in what it feels like to work in organisations that engage the public on the climate crisis, climate change communication, sometimes known. And for my doctoral fieldwork, which is not yet complete, not yet vivaed, complete but not yet vivaed, I brought together a group of people in organisations that talk to the public about climate change in some ways for nearly a year for 7 meetings. I'm just going to share my screen to bring that more visible for everyone. And the organisations I brought together included a big environmental NGO, a local authority, because local authorities are often on the front line of this kind of climate change communication, and then a very local community group, and a couple of small national charities, and a couple of religious groups, all based within the UK. And I'm going to share some aspects of the research which looked at the experience of the leaders in those organisations using the experience of the group that I brought together. So it was a kind of echo chamber, if you like, from the group to the organisational experience. And I'd like to start by showing everyone some material from an early meeting of the group, which I hope will give you something of a flavour of what the work felt like. I'm going to show you an image that was chosen by one of the group's participants. And this was for an activity that we did in our second meeting in February 2019, for which people brought photos that represented their work in some way. So I'm going to show you the image. I'll give you a few seconds just to look at it and to absorb it a little bit. And then I'll read you what the participant whose photo it is said about it in the meeting. So this was the participant's own perspective, feelings about what the photo represented. So I'm going to read now what the participant said in the meeting about this photo. So this is a government building in Cologne, in Germany, a week last Friday, when the first climate strike happened here in the UK. These kids were striking. It's this kind of brutalist government building, kids saying, you know, our future, you need to do something. And the response is, let's make sure we've got as many tooled up police and security guards as possible, standing between these obvious terrorists and, you know, the people who are supposed to represent them and defend their future. And it made me weep. It made me weep in a kind of sort of very hopeful way. I was so delighted to see some climate strikers, and given, you know, there was so much attention on it in the UK. It gives me hope that these kids are doing what they're doing, but then you look at the reaction. And for me, thinking about this, the more I look at this picture and the more I read what my colleagues said about it, the more I feel the sense of being trapped. That everyone here in the picture feels trapped, seems trapped in some way, caught between different aspects of experience, different generations, different aspects of power and hierarchy. And my participant felt trapped, I think, as well, because part of his experience was being, if you like, towards the government side, but trying to interact and trying to represent some of the voices that are not heard in government. And that's one aspect of what I think is a traumatic experience working in climate change communication. And I'm going to say a little bit about this. First of all, to outline what I think is traumatic about the experience, and much of what I'm going to say now has already been said today, so I will keep that short. And then I will go on to explore what might be the organisational response to that trauma. So there are ways of thinking about what constitutes trauma. There are several ways in which I think that the experience of working on climate change communication can be seen as traumatic. So we know that environmental researchers can be thought of as experiencing secondary trauma as a result of their work, seeing what is being done to our planet and to its inhabitants. And that is something that climate change communicators have to face. So there's an aspect of trauma there, and perhaps the facing extinction that brings is part of the trauma. The research study that was mentioned earlier today, Rosemary Randall and Paul Hoggett in 2018, which looked at the cultures of climate scientists and climate activists, pointed out that for some of the scientists, the experience of communicating climate science was harder for them, more difficult to handle, more emotionally demanding than the experience of the climate science itself. And that was, I think, because of the sense of polarization and the sense of coming under attack. And this is one of the things that, of course, climate communicators face all the time, being attacked by external groups. These are also people who work in organizations that have very little resource, and who may feel kind of almost outside of where the resources sit and where the decisions are being made. And so they are likely to feel overburdened just in an ordinary way with too much to do and very little resource to do it. But of course, they also feel, perhaps in a concentrated sort of way, the sense of overwhelm and overburdening that we heard so powerfully this morning from Eloise and Jennifer. Too much to do, can't manage this. We also heard this morning about the concept of collective intergenerational climate trauma, which is, of course, linked interwoven very closely with collective intergenerational racial trauma. And the two are, I think, different sides of the same thing. And so that is likely to be affecting these participants as well. There is also, and I think this has been touched on briefly today, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective, there is also, I think, an epistemological trauma around climate change. It's just too much to take in. We cannot have words for it. We cannot find a way to think about it. And that is intensified, as Zimmerman suggests, because we are positioned so strongly within a neoliberal framework. So we can't kind of imagine that there might be limits to what we can do, as well as Timothy Morton's idea that climate change is something that is a scale beyond what we can get our heads around. And I think also that climate change communicators are operating between epistemologies. They're trying to manage understanding the climate science with its post-positive epistemology, and working within a social science epistemology of how you engage people, how we can create change socially, but also perhaps how ordinary citizens think about science and what constitutes proof. And this is, I think, a really stressful place to be. And then finally, we have the idea from Sally Weintraub and others of the moral injury that climate change constitutes, and the institutional effect of that we were hearing about this morning. And that those moral injuries have been argued to be traumatic. So it's kind of not surprising then if there is an aspect of traumatized response in the organizations that take part in climate change communication. And what I found was a range of social defenses. And I think Ali and Ching, I recognized what I think you were saying about projecting vulnerability outwards, because I think what happens with climate change communication is perhaps a sense of shame and an acknowledgement of vulnerability, but perhaps a sense of being a receptacle for vulnerability that is not acknowledged elsewhere. So a lot of social defenses around shame and technology and busyness and difference, all of which encourage distance and exclusion. So it's very hard to come together. It's very hard to work as a team. It's very hard to feel that it's okay to be together. There was also a set of practices, if you like, around how difficult it is to grieve. So people brought their grief, they referred to their grief, they talked about what was making them sad. David Attenborough videos, stories about the loss of the natural world, but a really strong difficulty in making a place for the collective approach to grieving in the group, and I think in the workplaces as well. And as we know, in climate change communication, there has historically been a very strong insistence on we need to be positive, we need to be optimistic. And I think that is changing and becoming more problematized, and that's very helpful. But it's still a very strong part of the culture, I think, and certainly 2 years ago when I was doing my research, that was the case. So what I think I saw was an organizational defense, and I used Paul Hoggett's concept of the internal establishment, a kind of unconscious collective mechanism that says we will not think about this trauma, we will not think about this unthought known. And a basic assumption mentality, so drawing on the system psychodynamic ideas, Ali and Ching, that you were using, I was also using some of those ideas and thinking about a trauma-influenced basic assumption, or unconscious culture, if you like, which comes from Earl Hopper, and he calls it incohesion, aggregation, massification. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that with some images. The idea is that in an organization that is experiencing this kind of mentality, this kind of group mentality, this kind of basic assumption, you have an oscillation between opposite ends of a pole, where, for example, you might feel like, on the one hand, you're quite crustacean. You've got all your defenses on the outside, you're vulnerable inside, but nobody can see that. And you don't come together very much. So that would be one example of one pole of this. The opposite pole would be the amoeba, which is on the right hand side, where there's no difference between you, and there's no separation at all. So you love each other, but you haven't got a task you can do together, and because there is actually no separation, no ability to focus on anything outside the squashiness. Another metaphor for this is boiled potatoes on the left and mashed potatoes on the right. So boiled potatoes separate with skins, mashed potatoes all mushed up together. And then finally, the image on the left here is a flock of birds who come together because it's safer to be together. And they may be communicating, but we don't necessarily see that as humans. And on the right-hand side, you have a heap of walruses who look at least as if they are mushing up together. The language probably could be more technical than mush, but I find that's the word that comes to me. And so what you see in organizations that are experiencing this mentality is the oscillation between the two. And the oscillation serves as a defense. It stops you paying attention to the trauma that you've experienced, and it makes it very hard to come together and work together. You're either not focusing on the task or you're not focusing on the other people. So I will show you just briefly the references that I've drawn on for this. Obviously, that I'm not going to keep that up there for very long, but I hope that gives you something to take away, and then the slides will be circulated afterwards, I believe. So, Ali and Ching, it's nice to see you again now that I've turned my slides off. I've been thinking about, as you know, we've been talking about this, and so much of the experience of working on climate change seems to me to echo with the experience of clinical work, which is something to do with that, that wanting to fix, that being expected to fix something. And knowing that, of course, that's not really how it works. You know, climate change is not about fixing something, and it's not about, it's not possible to fix it. It's a whole different set of ideas and set of ways of being. So I wondered if your clinical experience has taught you something about how we can respond to those expectations that are so prevalent within both kinds of organizations.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Rebecca. Maybe I'll make a start on that one. Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that because I think as doctors throughout our whole training, there is something about, you know, we're trained and we're bred to try and fix problems, and that's probably why we got into the profession. I don't know about you, Ali, but for me, then going into mental health, one finds very quickly that I think it's actually incredibly difficult to fix things, not in the tangible, you know, you go to A&E, you hurt your arm, you get it patched up type of thing. And so for me, I think my long-standing experience also in mental health is actually the importance of not trying to just fix things, to try and like look for easy solutions. And in my mind, I think trying to quickly go into the mode of trying to fix things is almost kind of inherently connected with foreclosure and denial or burnout, actually, that one ends up trying to eliminate the problem rather than engage with it. And I think so from a mental health perspective, I think it's just this really interesting thing of, if you have a problem and it's not fixable or it's hard to fix, what is that space in between? And for me, that space probably is the space to mourn. It's probably a space for like keeping hold of uncertainty. And not only that, it's around, I think that that's actually a really important space because it's a space that maybe kind of incubates new potential. It's a space for integrating problems. And I think it's potentially the space for transformation. So I think that, you know, easy problems are fixed quickly, but actually holding on to that uncertainty and not for it not to be just conscious, but like a whole bodily kind of level of holding on to uncertainty is probably the site for radical transformation. And I guess for me, there's also something about, I was thinking from the earlier talks today around this question of empowerment. And in my mind, from the first talks, there was this thing about, you know, how can we keep feeling empowered? How can we keep hold of a desire to act when there isn't a quick, fixable, tangible thing to do? And to me, that's really crucial. It's not, I don't want to slip into the positive psychology, let's stay happy. It's not that, but it's like, what are the emotions here that lead to action versus disempowerment, where actually we feel like there's nothing to do? Because from a psychological perspective, I think if we feel disempowered, if there's nothing to do, the mind will solve the problem by cutting it off. You know, that's when we kind of slip into denial and everything else. It's a bit like from a physical point of view, if you can't run away from a tiger that's approaching you, you'll just faint. You know, your mind will just vacate your body instead. It's just like a really human drive. And so, you know, I don't have a set answer for that, but I think that the idea of empowerment is really important here. And like, what are the emotions that engender action? And for me, you know, especially listening to the previous talks, there's something about the need for connection and the need for people to feel listened to, and maybe the possibility of creating new meanings within that. So there's something about being able to feel joined up with other people in order to bring about collective action. And I just, you know, I kind of want to end with that, which is that I think those are really important human drives. So there is hopelessness and there are kind of emotions that alienate us and just make us stay still. But there are also really powerful emotions that human beings have, which relate to survival and the desire to be together. So if we can kind of harness a few of those things, even without fixable solutions, that would be my take home.
Great, thank you, Ching. And we only have a couple of minutes left. And so I'm thinking we might move on to the last part of your talk, Ally and Ching, where you were bringing in that fabulous nature-based history-taking protocol from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I loved that, and I kind of wanted it for myself, and I felt as if it could be a really powerful thing. And I know that from your experience, it feels as if there's very little organizational space for that kind of work. So maybe you could finish with just a few thoughts about that, Ali.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's such a big gap between my experience in terms of clinical practice and my ability to bring sustainability to, you know, I have up to 160 on my caseload in community psychiatry. And I'm noticing, you know, in the 4 months I've been in the job, no patient has brought this up. There's no space within and no space in time. And I think the amount of trauma, personal trauma to have to process first is just takes up so much of my clinical time. But as you refer to in terms of the nature-based histories, I think this gives us an idea of the possibilities that we can start introducing. And I think it has to start really quite early from, you know, from medical school onwards, really, so that we embed it as part of what we do in clinical practice and not just an add-on.
Yeah, thank you both. We've had our time. We've come up to the time boundary, and thank you both very much. It's been lovely to get to know you, and I'm going to hand back to Nadine.
Yeah, so thank you both, all three of you, for the insights that you've been bringing here with your research and the connections, Rebecca, that you were, the threads that you were managing to make there. And I just want to add that it kind of connects with research which I've done around the lived experience of sustainability professionals, and the findings that I discovered around threat responses and conflict and needs satisfaction, and also the role of nature connection. And Rebecca and I are presenting our research as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science on Monday the 29th of November. So if you want to hear more about these kind of topics in the context of organisations, then come to that, and we'll put the link in the chat. Now, what you just ended on there with the reflections on nature-based work segs very conveniently into our next session on nature connection and ecological grief.